Today's video is a truly chilling tale. It's centered on a group of individuals in Scotland who ventured into a notorious cemetery during the dead of night and stumbled upon something incredibly strange. And, believe it or not, they managed to capture a photo of it. Late one evening in November of 1999, a 66-year-old minister named Colin Grant unlocked the iron gates of a cemetery called Greyfriars Kirkyard. This particular cemetery is one of the oldest and most renowned in Edinburgh, Scotland. The cemetery itself was nearly pitch dark, with only a few aged iron lanterns dimly lighting up the cobblestone path that meandered through it. As Colin pushed the gates open, he stepped onto the pathway, with rows of headstones stretching as far as he could see on either side of him. Some of these gravestones were dated as far back as the 1600s. While walking, even in the thick of night, Colin could spot the huge Gothic-style church towering ahead in the center of the graveyard. At first glance, this appeared to be just another old, albeit eerie, graveyard. But Colin was well aware that there was much more beneath the surface. Hidden underground, below where the headstone stood, was a mass burial site, an unmarked grave filled with thousands of people who had been starved and tortured to death centuries earlier. As Colin paused briefly on the path, staring at the distant church, he felt an overwhelming urge to turn back and leave. He did not want to be here. The only reason he hadn't left was that the city had pleaded with him to come. In addition to being a minister, Colin claimed to be a psychic, which meant he could communicate with the dead. And tonight, the city desperately needed him to perform an exorcism here. Although Colin was scared, he knew he had a responsibility, not just to the city, but also to the people. He believed that if he didn't perform this exorcism, more individuals would likely be harmed. One small comfort for Colin was that he wasn't completely alone. With him in the cemetery were a journalist and a photographer from a local newspaper who had joined him to document the event. After collecting his thoughts for a moment, Colin began walking deeper into the cemetery, with the two companions following closely behind. Before reaching the main church, Colin veered off the path, cutting through the grass between the various tombstones, heading towards the most infamous structure in the entire cemetery, the Black Mausoleum. This stone crypt, built sometime in the late 1600s, was a tall, rounded-top structure that had a particularly ominous aura about it. As Colin neared the building, a heavy sense of dread washed over him, growing stronger with each step. The feeling of unease eventually intensified to the point where Colin had to stop about 10 feet from the mausoleum. He couldn't move any closer. It felt as though the very air around the building was evil. Colin glanced over at his companions to gauge their reactions, but both the journalist and photographer wore blank expressions. They didn't appear to feel anything unusual. Even though the city had brought Colin in to perform this exorcism, not everyone believed in the supernatural events that were said to occur here. The two with him were clearly skeptical, but Colin wasn't bothered by their doubt. He was used to people questioning his beliefs. He was confident that once he started the exorcism, they would change their minds. At some point, Colin turned to the photographer and asked her to take a picture of the mausoleum before he went inside. She raised her camera, snapped the shot, and Colin thanked her. Then, summoning all his courage, he approached the mausoleum. Standing in front of the crypt, he looked up and read the name etched across its top, George Mackenzie. At that moment, Colin felt his heart start to race. Back in the late 1600s, George Mackenzie had been a Scottish lord who served the King of England by enforcing unpopular religious laws. One particular group, the Covenanters, despised these laws so much that they launched a rebellion in 1679. However, the rebellion was quickly crushed. George Mackenzie then took over, capturing over 1,000 Covenanters and herding them into a massive field, which would later become Greyfriars Kirkyard Cemetery. For weeks, Mackenzie had the captives starved and mutilated. Those who tried to escape were unalived, and their heads were placed on spikes along the perimeter of the field. Eventually, after months of this horrific treatment, most of the prisoners had been unalived in Grizzly Ways by Mackenzie. Their bodies were unceremoniously dumped into a mass grave on the grounds of what would become Greyfriars Kirkyard. Hundreds of years later, the cemetery was built directly over this pit. Despite his brutal actions, George Mackenzie lived a full and content life and, upon his death, was laid to rest in a grand mausoleum just steps away from the mass grave of his victims. Here stood a man responsible for countless deaths, resting in peace in a lavish crypt while those he unalived were buried in a pit nearby. For nearly 300 years following Mackenzie's burial, Greyfriars Kirkyard remained peaceful. It wasn't regarded as a haunted spot. However, everything changed in 1998, just 1 year before Colin was called to perform the exorcism. That year, a homeless man broke into the Black Mausoleum and fell through the floor, landing in one of the mass graves filled with the bodies of those unalived by George Mackenzie. Almost immediately after this incident, visitors to the cemetery began reporting strange occurrences. Whenever they ventured near the mausoleum, they felt like they were being pushed, tugged, scratched, burned, or even strangled. People left the cemetery absolutely terrified. Quickly, rumors spread around town about what might be happening. Many began to speculate that when the homeless man fell through the mausoleum's floor, he may have unleashed George Mackenzie's evil spirit, and that this spirit was responsible for the attacks. The situation worsened over the next year, until a young woman was found unconscious near the Black Mausoleum, appearing as though she had been strangled. When she regained consciousness, she had no recollection of what had happened. Many believed this was yet another harm by the spirit of George Mackenzie. By this point, the city was fed up with the unexplained events. They were desperate for a solution and decided to attempt an exorcism. The plan was to confront George Mackenzie's spirit head-on inside the mausoleum and banish him for good. Colin was ultimately chosen to perform this task. As Colin stood in front of the mausoleum, reading George Mackenzie's name and mentally preparing to enter, he realized he couldn't do it. The weight of the task was too much. He felt completely overwhelmed, embarrassed, and like a coward for not following through. He had no idea how to explain to the photographer and journalist who had come to document the exorcism that he wasn't going to go through with it. As Colin turned around, ready to admit defeat, he suddenly had another idea. Without saying a word, Colin started walking quickly toward a large field not far from the Black Mausoleum. Once there, he began pacing in circles, chanting prayers and flicking holy water. He offered no explanation to the photographer and journalist, who watched in confusion, unsure of what was happening. They assumed he was still performing the exorcism, so they simply observed as he continued his ritual. For hours, Colin walked and chanted, while the photographer, Susan Burrell, snapped pictures of him, documenting the supposed exorcism. Around 2 a.m., after hours of this ritual, Colin finally stopped and walked over to the photographer and journalist, looking completely exhausted. His hair was disheveled, he was pale, and he was sweating. With his head hung low, Colin told them, "I failed." He explained that his original plan was to confront George Mackenzie's spirit in the mausoleum and banish him from the cemetery. However, at the last moment, he changed his approach. Instead of dealing directly with Mackenzie's spirit, he decided to go to the field and attempt to free the spirits of the Covenanters, the innocent people unalived by Mackenzie. Colin believed that if he could free these trapped souls, it might cause Mackenzie's spirit to leave the cemetery as well. He claimed to have freed over 200 souls that night, but there were many more that still needed to be released, and he didn't have the strength to continue. He said he would need to return another time to finish the job. The journalist and photographer were unimpressed and tired. They didn't fully understand what had happened and weren't sure if what they had witnessed was the exorcism or something else entirely. Nonetheless, they agreed to leave, feeling that the night had been unproductive. As the trio walked towards the cemetery exit, passing by the church between the Black Mausoleum and the field, Colin suddenly stopped again. He told the journalist and photographer that he had a little strength left and felt obligated to make another attempt. He believed he could free more souls, so he prepared to give it one last effort. The journalist and the photographer, standing by, gave Colin the go-ahead to continue. Colin, determined to press on, retrieved his Bible and resumed the same actions he had performed earlier in the field, walking in circles, chanting Bible verses, and sprinkling holy water all around. However, for reasons unknown to either Susan or the journalist, Colin then pulled out 12 candles from his backpack. He carefully arranged them in a circle on the ground directly in front of the church, even encompassing a large Celtic cross that was lying there. Colin positioned himself within the circle and lit all the candles, continuing to chant as he did so. Once the candles were all alight, something eerie happened. Susan and the journalist observed the candles beginning to flicker, despite the fact that there was no wind at all in the cemetery. At the same time, Colin seemed to sense a presence. He turned his entire body toward the black mausoleum and began chanting the Bible verses even louder, directing his words toward the crypt. As Colin's voice grew louder and more intense, the flickering of the candles became more pronounced. At one point, Colin picked up one of the candles and extended it towards the mausoleum, as if challenging whatever presence might be lurking there. The photographer and journalist, both sensing that something unusual was unfolding, grew uneasy. The flickering candles and Colin's behavior made the atmosphere heavy with suspense. For a few moments, they were so captivated by the bizarre scene that they forgot their role as documenters, simply standing there in awe. Then, Susan snapped out of it, raising her camera to capture the moment. Just as Colin was in the middle of his impassioned chanting, she pressed the shutter button. The camera flash illuminated the cemetery, and almost instantly, Colin collapsed, crumpling to the ground as if the life had been drained from him. The journalist rushed over to check on Colin, who was barely conscious and muttering repeatedly, "This is going to unalive me. This is going to unalive me." Susan was about to join her colleague when she glanced down at the camera to view the picture she had just taken. What she saw stunned her. Initially, she thought it might be a trick of the light, something that couldn't possibly be real. But when she zoomed in, her heart skipped a beat, and she let out a scream. Here's the photograph Susan took. In it, you can see Colin standing with the candle outstretched, and behind him is the large church. On the left side of the church are several windows. Despite the church being locked and empty, a figure is clearly visible in one of the windows, staring out directly at Colin. While this image isn't definitive proof that the figure is the spirit of George Mackenzie, many people believe it is. Some even think this figure was responsible for Colin's sudden collapse. Though skeptics might argue otherwise, no one has ever debunked the photo, and the figure in the window remains a mystery to this day. The church was supposed to be completely vacant, so how is there someone or something in that window? After Colin's collapse, he continued to mutter that the exorcism would unalive him. Sadly, he was right. Not long after the failed exorcism, Colin passed away unexpectedly, leaving his friends and family in shock. To this day, the photo Susan took remains unexplained, and the mysterious figure in the window has fueled ongoing speculation about the presence of George Mackenzie's spirit in the cemetery. Many believe that this dark entity may have been responsible for Colin's untimely death. Even now, Greyfriars Kirkyard is regarded as one of the most haunted places in the world, with numerous visitors reporting strange occurrences such as scratches, shoves, and even strangulation. George Mackenzie's spirit is thought to be one of the most dangerous poltergeists in the world. And there you have it, a chilling tale of haunted history, a failed exorcism, and a photograph that continues to raise more questions than answers. Was the spirit of George Mackenzie responsible for Colin's fate? Or was it simply a tragic coincidence? While skeptics may never be convinced, the eerie events at Greyfriars Kirkyard leave many wondering what truly lingers within those ancient walls. If you ever find yourself wandering near the Black Mausoleum, beware, because some doors once opened can never be closed. Thanks for watching. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts or any ghostly experiences you've had in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and remember, some mysteries are better left unexplored.